All right, I believe that I am back. Thomas, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Please take the stage.
All right, let me share my presentation and then we'll get started. All right. Hope everyone can see the presentation, or at least the first slide. Yep, okay, thank you. All right, so hi everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Before I dive into it, I'd like to personally thank the DigiShares team for putting together such a great event and for giving us the opportunity to present to you today. By way of introduction, my name is Thomas Borrel and I'm Chief Product Officer at Polymath. Over the next 25-30 minutes, we're going to talk about Polymath's perspective, strategy, and visions for the future. As you can appreciate, I won't get into every little detail of our strategy. There's still a few things that we like to keep to ourselves, have a few surprises every now and then, but happy to share as much as possible with you today. But first, for those of you who don't know who Polymath is a software company driven by a vision of a world where everyone has equal access to economic growth, and we're doing it to execute on this. We're doing it to deliver on this vision. We're essentially automating and simplifying regulated markets, and to do that, we're contributing to a dependable, compliance-focused blockchain called Polymesh that can help connect market participants and grow the security token market. Now, let's talk about security tokens, and more specifically, let's start with the market. And when I think about where the security token market is today, the very first thought that comes to mind is a quote from Jay Biancamano, the head of digital assets at State Street. When asked about digital assets, Mr. Biancamano said, "We're seeing assets start to become digitized, trickle, 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 and then we believe there will be a flood." And trickling, it has. In my opinion, this quote is a very good representation of what we're seeing, particularly with institutions. Most of us, if not all of us here today, are firm believers in digital asset, and highlighting or focusing on like-minded early adopters with a background similar to ours would certainly make us feel good, but I believe that for this market to get into numbers that truly matter, numbers that get everyone's attention, we need institutions to move in. Those institutions may be the one we know today, but they don't have to be. They can be newer, more nimble, higher growth institutions that are looking to fundamentally transform the way they're operating, as well as differentiate from their competition. So with that, let's take a look at what happened over the years. And I realize that Alex just shared some numbers, but I'm proposing a slightly different perspective. Looking at 2019, we can see some of these digital assets trickling in. Established institutions like Deutsche Bank, Bank of China, Banco Santander issued tokenized bonds. SocGen issued a €100 million 5-year COVID bond in 2019. Moving to 2020, we've started to see even more of these digital assets trickling in. HSBC and SGX executed a $300 million digital bond. BTG Pactual, that Alex just mentioned, tokenized real estate in Brazil. Vanguard completed the phase 1 of its security issuance pilot. BNP Paribas, in collaboration with Curve, unveiled a secure method to transfer security tokens using the ERC 1400 standard. Last but not least, SocGen issued a AAA rated covered bond. And what's interesting there is that we start to see additional layers being added to the issuance, from an initial POC of an asset issued by an institution to themselves to now having that asset come with a AAA rating. And in 2021, things continue to both accelerate and grow both in size and in complexity. And by size, I'm not necessarily referring to the size of the investment, but rather the number of participants involved in the transaction. In 2021, SBI launched an STO that was targeted at retail investors, so going after a much broader base. Deutsche Börse and Deutsche Bundesbank tested settlement. And in more recent news, the European Investment Bank issued a €100 million bond. And what's particularly interesting here is that this issuance involved several banks. It involved SocGen, it involved Goldman Sachs, it involved Banco Santander, but it also involved a CBDC that was issued by the BDF, by the Banque de France. So yes, we're continuing to see proof of concepts and other form of test issuances, but there is a clear progression towards full production scale issuances. And so this begs the question, going back to the original quote, will 2020 be that year of the flood? And in my opinion, it will be. If we look at the progression, and we pick SocGen's work in particular, it's very natural to think that comes 2022, institutions will start bringing in their larger clients. As an industry, though, there's still very important changes we need to make to help create that flood, to help foster adoption. And that starts with how we communicate. That starts how we position what we do. In my opinion, the biggest mistake that we've made as an industry has been to lead with the blockchain, lead with the technology as opposed to leading with the benefits. We're so excited by the potential and so excited by the opportunity that blockchain can bring across our markets that we simply cannot stop talking about it or get into its details and its intricacies. And that's making it very complicated for our target users to understand what we actually offer, what problem we're solving, what benefits we can bring to them. In its most simplistic form, you could look at tokenization as a very innovative dematerialization process, one that allows for risk reduction. How we manage as an industry to help reduce that risk is with the elimination of manual processes, those manual processes that were very error-prone. And as a result, this new process can enable more transactions to occur within the same time period, which as a consequence has a very positive impact on the liquidity of these assets. And so that same ability to automate and de-risk allows the creation of new assets that was simply not possible before, either because they came with too high a risk or too high a cost to issue, service, or manage. So this enhanced dematerialization process enables liquidity and the augmentation of capital markets. And to accomplish that and to deliver at scale would just so happen to use a blockchain because of all the capabilities and possibilities its technology brings to bear. The blockchain should be that hidden part of the iceberg, with the value being what the rest of the world needs to see. Users may need to know what's underneath the surface. Users may want to know what's underneath the surface, but they should not be forced to know. And that's what makes solutions like DigiShares so exciting, for instance, because they abstract the chain from the investors. And I believe that that perspective is validated by what we're seeing today with institutions trying to decide how close to the chain they want to be. In the early days, some dove right in, joining a variety of consortia and which they're now exiting or they're no longer actively participating on. Others today are looking to access the chain via an API, a system that essentially makes the blockchain completely invisible to them. But that supports the middle office and back office operations with settlement, trade reporting, asset servicing, etc. Users don't really care about the back-end technology that is used, and neither should they. They want to know that it's secure, they want to know that it's reliable, they want to know that it's going to support their business continuity needs. Sure, there'll be an extensive due diligence that will be conducted, but that due diligence is likely to be performed by someone who's more interested in the technology, not the typical user that wants to consume its value. For example, should all users be forced to create a wallet? Should they have to manage or store their keys? Should they care? As we collectively continue to focus on the technology, we're essentially imposing a decision on users, forcing them to be very close to the chain instead of leaving them the choice and giving them a few options to pick from totally invisible to completely visible and anywhere in between. But making the chain invisible is not something we should do only for users. There are specific side effects of the technology that are adding complexity and slowing adoption. A good example of that is contentious forks. What makes contentious forks so interesting is that it creates an issue that is very specific to blockchain. I personally have never had two database admins tell me that they disagreed on a software upgrade, and they had decided that both systems would continue to operate, and then I had to pick one. So when it comes to security tokens, contentious forks can create those massive headaches, starting with which token is the token that's backed by the actual asset. In the case of real estate, where's my building? On which chain is it? What is the exchange strategy? How are we going to communicate with investors to let them know which token is backed by the real asset and which one is not? And is that creation of the second token as a result of the contentious fork a taxable event? And all these questions could be avoided by simply avoiding contentious forks. Now, of course, that example is one of several, but it remains an important one for asset issuers with potentially significant legal and tax costs and complexities. Another focus area where we need to make the blockchain invisible is transaction finality. Transaction finality in capital markets has a very clear definition, and that definition, as you can see in the settlement finality directive from the EU, comes with a time expectation. That transaction finality must be real time. Now, in practice, if we look at systems like T2S, a 2017 study from Capgemini showed that T2S would reach finality for a transaction between 2 to 15 seconds. Now, if we look at how this translates into blockchain term, and more specifically, if we look at what this means on an Ethereum blockchain, to talk about finality and time to finality, we need to talk about number of blocks because of potential risk of block reordering, and we need to talk about block times. So in that case of Ethereum, depending on how many blocks it takes to bring the legal definition of finality as close as possible to the technical definition, we need to wait 4, 5, 6, perhaps even more blocks. And at an average block time of 13 seconds, that time starts to add up. And beyond time is risk. Depending on how many blocks it takes to bring the legal definition of finality to reach that legal definition, then any transaction on Ethereum would essentially become risk-based, which I believe is counter to the very definition of finality and drags unnecessary capital requirements and other complexities. So as we aim to make the chain invisible, we need to make sure that we don't introduce new problems, that we don't shift the complexity from well-understood rails to new unknowns. And another group we need to make sure, for which we need to make sure the blockchain is invisible, are regulators. Regulators often remind us that they're technology agnostic, but some of the approaches we take force them to some degree to look at blockchain differently, simply because of new functional entities that get inserted into the flow. A good example of that is DVP, delivery versus payment, a very common approach, and frankly, one that we took in the early days when we spearheaded the work on ERC 1400 and we were working on Ethereum, was to use a smart contract to do DVP. And it can be a very effective and very efficient approach to automating the process while limiting counterparty risk. But it introduces new questions. Which legal entity is emitting the smart contract? What license do they have to do that? That smart contract will need to take custody of the assets for a short period of time. Is it a good control location? Is there any issue? If there's any issue with the smart contract, who will bear the responsibility of making the counterparties whole? So as we continue to bring innovation to capital markets, we need to make sure we consider how we position what we're building, how we describe it, but also we need to make sure that we don't introduce new questions, new challenges. And that means making sure that we build technology that can support our specific goals. That means moving from general purpose to purpose built. And technology is one part of it. Processes and operations also need to be considered. A good example of that here is custody. For example, in North America, we see predominantly omnibus type custody, where the custodian has one account, one set of keys to manage that account, and all their clients' assets are commingled and the actual ownership tracked using some type of off-chain ledger. In Europe, we're seeing more segregation between those accounts. Custodians have individual accounts for each of their clients. This approach materially reduces the need for that off-chain ledger to track ownership of individual asset. And so that selection of approach to custody is very important, as it can have a material impact on the benefits that we as an industry are able to demonstrate to the market. For instance, omnibus custody requires very high reconciliation efforts. When a transaction occurs, that transaction is captured and enacted off-chain. Nothing moves on-chain. And as a result, the information that's on-chain does not show the real ownership. So we effectively lose a lot of the transparency there. It also provides very limited automation capabilities. If the asset needs to move from bank A to bank B because no operation will occur on-chain, there's no on-chain business logic that can be used to distribute capital or collect votes. In the case of a fully segregated approach, reconciliation efforts are significantly lower and the opportunity to automate materially greater. Whether being related to transfer control or the execution of corporate action, automation can play a much stronger role here. In that case, the infrastructure can automate the distribution of capital, withhold taxes, collect votes, make sure that votes are accounted for based on the status of the settlement of transactions. As in some jurisdictions, settlement will have to complete for an asset holder to be able to vote, and in others, they won't have to. But there's also a third approach to that can help reduce reconciliation effort, and that's with the use of sub-accounts. In that case, custodians still have to manage a single key, but each one of their clients has an account, a sub-account, that is sub to their own, the custodian's main account. This approach gives greater transparency, as clients can see their holdings directly on Ledger, but still provides some limited automation capabilities. And the decision between these different approaches is often driven by the number of keys that will need to be managed, when it should be driven by the operational benefits brought forth by each approach. So I've just shared a few perspectives on the market, how it was historically approached. And I suppose the question that several of you have is that, well, that's all well and good, but what is Polymath doing about it? What is the North Star that's guiding you on your every decision? Well, let's start with the foundations. Oops. At Polymath, our focus is on automating capital markets, not replacing the current infrastructure. Public markets have very efficient and effective rails that are battle-tested and can handle trillions of dollars of value. In my opinion, any discussion that goes down the path of building the future of public equity markets ends up being an ROI type discussion, and one that we'll most likely lose. Since we embarked on this journey in 2017, we've had the opportunity to talk to a very long list of banks and institutions. Personally, I joined very early in 2018, and by then we were allocating already a material amount of our time to having these discussions, so we could make sure we really understood the problem we wanted to solve and validate all our hypotheses. What institutions told us that we're looking for is a way to help their clients diversify. How can I give access to new assets to my clients, assets that they were unable to invest in before? Perhaps because they were too small and flew below their radar, or perhaps because they were just impossible to create because the costs from issuance to servicing to ongoing management that was simply too high, or risk was too hard to measure or too hard to manage. So when we look at the market, I believe that it's important that we talk about how we're building an infrastructure that stands besides the existing capital markets infrastructure and enables the creation of these new assets, enables asset managers to propose differentiated diversification strategies to their clients, an infrastructure that enables smaller investors to access larger assets and larger investors to access smaller assets. It's about building an infrastructure that complements public markets. Eventually, after we've demonstrated that value we've all been talking about, we'll have earned the right to ask for public markets infrastructure to transition over. But until such time, let's focus on augmenting the market. And what does that mean specifically? Well, that means empowering permissioned DeFi. Permission because securities are subject to stringent compliance requirements, know your customer, anti-money laundering. It's about creating new assets, but also new ways for investors that are holding these assets to leverage them as collateral in a variety of transactions, essentially feeding these security tokens into a broader decentralized finance construct that spans beyond commodity and utility to include these securities. And that's something we've all heard several times already today. Carl mentioned it, Klaus mentioned it as well. And as we manage to bridge that gap beyond the crypto market into the securities market, which is already in itself in the hundreds of trillions of dollars of value, how hard can it be to imagine that we can take today's $129 billion worth of DeFi market and grow it to $1 trillion or 10 trillion or perhaps even more? The only way we can get there is by leading by the benefits, by making the chain invisible. And for Polymath, it meant building a purpose-built infrastructure, not contort an existing one, bend it into something completely different from what it was originally designed to do. Be a pseudonymous or censorship-resistant platform or support the gaming market. We decided that we were not going to subject users to variable and often astronomical transaction fees, not build a patchwork of components designed to address compliance. And what that meant building an infrastructure that includes identity, compliance, confidentiality, governance, and ensures proper transaction finality right at its core. These 5 major challenges are ones we've heard repeatedly from institutions over the years, and we continue to hear today. Frankly, these are barriers to entry we thought we could address using the existing public permissionless infrastructure back in 2017, 2018. But what we came to realize very quickly was that that approach was not solving the problem. It was shifting it. It was creating new questions, new complexities that needed more legal opinions, more tax opinions. So essentially, we're taking those cost savings and we were giving it to the lawyers, converting it into additional legal expenses. And what has been very encouraging is to see institutions coming to us today with those very questions and realizing that what we have built with Polymesh is essentially the answer to their problem. So as a company, what we're building is we're building the technology and collaborating with market participants to empower users with choice and global market access. We're a technology company. We're building software, we're building infrastructure, and we're collaborating with these organizations that can deliver software and or services, organizations like DigiShares for cap table management, token sell platform, and others that can deliver custody, KYC, AML, or even larger integrated solution designed to support the full asset lifecycle on top of an infrastructure that connects market participants, but does not overexpose the technology. We still have work to do, but we made great progress. And we have delivered a solution that does not sidestep those unwanted questions. We're still allowing us to attain our goals. And so, if you're interested in understanding where we are on this journey, Polymesh started its multi-year journey in May of 2019. In fact, research started long before that, but May 2019 is when we announced the Polymesh blockchain initiative. We released the first testnet in May of 2020, a second one in September of 2020, and since April of this year, we've been operating an incentivized testnet. And so far, that incentivized testnet has been going very well. We've seen over 6,000 stakers distributed across 40 different nodes, with all these nodes being operated by broker-dealers, custodians, exchanges, ATSs, etc. Polymesh has also developed a strong community that continues to execute challenges as they're made available and provides constructive feedback to help us make tweaks across the various components of the platform. This testnet has allowed us to learn a lot on key topics like onboarding, as we had users from over 90 countries go through real identity verification, real match against sanctions list, so they could join the incentivized testnet. And we're applying all these learnings as we continue our march towards the mainnet launch. The testnets and all their associated user interfaces are also giving us a great platform to continue our engagement with regulated organizations to collaborate on integrated solutions. So before we move into questions, and just to sort of close today's presentation, don't hesitate to contact me if you're interested in learning more about Polymesh, or if you'd like to discuss potential integrations. And you can find more ways of connecting with us here. And so with this, I'll just take a quick look at the tab. Oh, right. So, Klaus, are you planning interoperability for Polymesh with other blockchains such as ETH and Polkadot? So the short answer to that is yes. So first and foremost, the underpinning of Polymesh is actually Parity Substrate, which is the engine behind Polkadot as well. So there's a lot of similarities here. But when we talk about interoperability, we actually look at interoperability with other blockchain infrastructure as well as traditional rails. And we see this in the context of settlement, for example. So we've built the settlement engine to support interoperability with existing payment rails as well as other chains. So that's built right into the core of the chain. What do you think about the idea of full decentralization in blockchain like Freeton and Same? I think there's certainly a lot of use cases for fully decentralized blockchains. There's a lot of applications for it. And when we look at Polymesh, we're the first to admit that Polymesh is not the chain where you're going to want to do everything and anything. There are use cases for that sort of generalistic infrastructure. We, with a clear focus on security tokens, decided that security tokens needed their own purpose-built infrastructure. But to go back to your question, there's certainly a massive market for fully decentralized blockchains. Personally, I don't believe that this is where security tokens, the security token market is going to be able to grow and get into the trillions of dollars. But maybe I could be wrong. All right. Why are the cost of issuing an STO so high? Not referring to the legal costs here. Going forward, how can it be reduced? So I'm not entirely sure how you break down the cost. There's actually been a very interesting study from HSBC on the issuance of green bonds that was showing that over the entire life cycle of the asset, from issuance to the ongoing servicing and management of the asset, the cost will actually be reduced by approximately 90%. So if I remember correctly, the numbers for that green bond was about $6.3 million using sort of traditional systems, and closer to $700K using blockchain type infrastructure. All right, I think that's the end of our time. So thank you everyone, and by all means, let's have a talk if you're interested. Thank you.